The following teaching contains depictions and explanations of darkness and evil, demons and demonic possession, and how the work of Jesus transcends it all. Viewer discretion is advised.
A number of years ago, I was in the city of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And I was spending a week there working with some missionaries, doing some things in the region and the city. And we were staying in a guest house, and every day we had to travel across the city to get to where we were going to be doing some of the work. And we were riding in this big van, like a bus-like van with a whole bunch of us in it. And so I was just sitting in the back. We're going through the city, and I'm watching people along the streets as we're driving along. And the second day I was there, I just was startled. I saw this man walking up the street, waving his arms. He was just as hairy, like huge beard, hair everywhere. And he was completely naked, animated, talking to himself, and people were just walking by. And I was so taken by that. I thought, like, how does that happen? And sure enough, the next day, we're traveling back across the city, and there's the same man again. Only this time, he's just sitting there, almost squatting and mumbling to himself, completely naked, and everybody is walking by as if this is just normal, everyday life in the city. And I was so taken back by that and really stunned, because I don't think I'd ever seen anybody naked walking down the street in any of the other cities that I'd ever been in. And so this was a first for me. And it was really strange. And maybe it's strange for you, but I don't think that it's necessarily unfamiliar. And this leads into what we're looking at today as we talk about the spiritual realm, as we look at the spiritual realm from the sense of evil and fallenness, devils and demons. And there's actually a story in the scriptures about this naked dude that Jesus has a conversation with. And so I want to read this for us today from Luke chapter 8. It's actually in Mark chapter 5 as well, but I chose to walk us through Luke's version of this story. It's Jesus and the demoniac. And beginning at verse 26, Luke tells us this about this exchange. So just to give you a bit of lead into it, Jesus has said to the disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. They're in the region of Galilee, so let's go to the east side of the lake. And as they're crossing the lake is when we read the story about the great storm, and Jesus calms the storm. And then they get to this other side, and then the story continues from there. So they arrived in the region of the Gerasenes, across the lake from Galilee. And as Jesus was climbing out of the boat, a man who was possessed by demons came out to meet him. For a long time, he had been homeless and naked, living in a cemetery outside the town. And as soon as he saw Jesus, he shrieked and he fell down in front of him and he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Please, I beg you, don't torture me." Jesus had already commanded the evil spirit to come out of the man. And the spirit had often taken control of the man. Even when he was placed under guard and put in chains and shackles, he simply broke them. And he rushed out into the wilderness, completely under the demon's power. And Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, for he was filled with many demons. And the demons kept begging Jesus not to send them into the bottomless pit. Well, there happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby, and the demons begged him to let them enter into the pigs. So Jesus gave them permission. This is just such a bizarre story. And then the demons came out of the man, and they entered the pigs, and the entire herd plunged down the steep hillside into the lake, and they drowned. And when the herdsmen saw it, they fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, and they spread the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. And a crowd, as it usually happens, soon gathered around Jesus. And they saw the man who had been freed from the demons. And he was sitting at Jesus' feet. And he was fully clothed. And he was perfectly sane. And they were all afraid. And then those who had seen what happened told the others how the demon-possessed man had been healed. And all the people in the region of the Gerasenes begged Jesus to go away, leave them alone. For a great wave of fear swept over them. So Jesus returned to the boat and he left, crossing back to the other side of the lake. And the man who had been freed from the demons begged to go with them, but Jesus sent him home, saying to him, "Go back to your family and tell them everything God has done for you." So he went all through the town proclaiming the great things that Jesus had done for him. It just is such a bizarre story. It's not stuff that we're familiar with. And every time I read that story now, I think of that man that I saw in Addis Ababa. And I wonder whatever became of him. And so as we approach Halloween and we see our society kind of having fun with dark and evil things, it's maybe helpful to look at this passage and kind of ask the question, what do we do with this? What do you do with these dark powers or demons, and can people really get possessed by them? And so let's touch on this a little bit today and talk about Jesus and these powers. One of the things that Luke does so well in his writing is he helps us see how Jesus crosses boundaries. This whole story is about Jesus saying, let's go to the other side of the lake. And so he's with his disciples in Jewish land. And he's saying, you know what? I want to go to the other side. And I'm sure everybody is thinking like, whoa, wait, what? You want to go to the other side of the lake? You know who lives there, right? Non-Jewish people, Gentile people, unclean people, filthy people. And Jesus is saying to them, yeah, that's where I want to go. Let's go. And so they go across the lake. And while they're on the lake, the storm comes up. And then Jesus stills the storm. And the disciples are amazed. And if you remember back to the teaching that we had in Job, where God has power over the chaos, which is represented by the deep waters. Here's Jesus showing his disciples, I have power and authority over these powers of chaos. This darkness that you're so afraid of bows to me. And then they get to the shore, and it's as if Jesus is saying, you think that was good? Come with me. I want to show you something else. And so here's Jesus crossing boundaries. He's going to an unclean place. He is meeting with unclean people who are not Jewish. He is meeting a man who lives in the cemetery among dead bodies who are not clean. These people work with pigs for a living, which are not clean. And Jesus is saying, these are my people too. We are so great at drawing boundaries in our worlds, back then and still today. And one of the things that Jesus does is he crosses boundaries. And in this story where we can get so caught up with this man and his demons, I think it's important that we don't miss the fact that Jesus will cross boundaries to pick a fight, to release someone, to free them. And there's this wonderful example for us. And think about where he does this elsewhere. In John 4, the woman at the well who's a Samaritan, Jesus crosses boundaries to have a conversation with her. In Matthew 9, Matthew, who's following Jesus, throws a party, and Jesus hangs out with all these people. And the religious elites are saying, like, why are you hanging out with those people? They are scum. Think of all the leper stories in the scriptures where Jesus doesn't just heal a leper, he touches them, and he essentially makes himself unclean by touching him. Jesus crosses the boundaries that we make to free people who are being held in bondage. And it's a great example. It's a wonderful illustration for us in how we so often other people, and we put them on the other side, and we perceive them as being evil or at least influenced by evil. And that begs this question. What is going on in this story? This man is possessed by a demon? Really? Like, is that just, first century superstition? Or is this real? What do we do with this element of Jesus and dark spiritual powers, what we would call demons? How are we supposed to manage this today? And in the story, this man's torment is deeply, deeply personal. There are a legion of voices that are controlling his will. And Jesus just simply confronts these demons, and he does it with a quiet, calm authority. And so we're left kind of asking, does that really happen? How do we look at what this story is teaching us? And I think there's two kind of common themes of looking at spiritual entities or powers or demons in the scriptures. And one of them would say, these aren't real, they're representative. They are not allegorical, but maybe just they are representative of fallen, broken systems and structures. So there's a man, Walter Wink, who's a scholar, represents this position really well. And this is what he says. The powers are not intrinsically evil. The powers that we're talking about, like this story, they're not intrinsically evil. They are the good creation of God that has fallen. They may be redeemed, but they don't need to be destroyed. The struggle is not against persons, but against systems and the spirit gone bad. So Wink would help us see evil as institutions like racism, militarism, greed, nationalism. And he would call those the domination systems. And so these powers kind of take on this collective personality that enslaves whole regions or whole systems of people. So they're not necessarily these individual personal beings that are oppressing, tormenting, taking over people, but rather they are systems in play that are broken, that are fallen, that are bent, and they enslave whole groups of people. And so that's one way of looking at demons. But you can hold this alongside of someone like N.T. Wright from the Church of England, where he writes this: the New Testament writers were not being metaphorical when they spoke of demons. They believed that there are personal and malevolent intelligences in God's world that seek to corrupt and destroy it. So Wright would have us understand, no, these are actual spiritual, personal beings that are at war with God and his creation and his people. And the biblical writers saw them that way, and that we would do well to understand them that way as well. These are not just psychological forces, these are personal ones. And I would say my own experience, having been in ministry for a few decades, is I've just been in places where I have seen whole regions and groups of people that just seem to be enslaved and in bondage. And I can so understand the systems that are at play that are just, I don't know how to describe them other than calling them evil. But I have also sat with individuals where I just thought, I have no idea what's going on here. And I just lean into Jesus and his power and his help. So maybe there's a way to just kind of see how both of these positions can describe accurately the world in which we live. One thing I know is that I'm not advocating for kind of what I grew up with in the 80s and 90s, which just seemed to be like there was a whole production made out of people that were demon-possessed, and we were exorcising them. And there was this infatuation in the 80s and 90s of personifying demons to the point that I just think it's done so much harm and so much damage. What I see happening here is Jesus interacting with evil, whether it's systemic or whether it is a personal being, and he is shaking up the establishment because he's willing to confront it. And I find it fascinating in this story, I think it's verse 37, the townspeople come You know, Jesus frees this man and delivers him. And the townspeople come and they're like, dude, please leave. We don't like what's happening here. We don't like what you're doing. And I think what Jesus has done, he has threatened their normal. I think we can become blind to the evil that's all around us. And Jesus steps in and he shakes up their world and he threatens their normalcy and he threatens their control over it. And importantly, in this situation, I think when we confront evil, often it comes at a cost. In this case, it's a financial cost. This massive herd of pigs ends up in the lake and the people's response is, you need to get out of here. How many evil systems are there in our world today that are holding people in bondage for the financial benefit of others? And I would say those are legion. Jesus disrupted this system and it was not met with smiling faces. And thankfully, Jesus puts this individual over the system that's at play. And he restores this man. So he has this conversation with him, with the demons really, and then he releases this man from the demons. And the man wants to be with Jesus. And Luke tells us, as the people come running, they find this man. He is sane, he is in his right mind, and he is clothed, and he is sitting with Jesus. This man that ran around breaking shackles and chains and tormenting himself and tormenting others. And here he is sitting with Jesus in his right mind, and he has been made whole again. But what happens here is the people aren't necessarily receptive of him at this point. And that's potentially partly why he wants to get in the boat and go with Jesus. And it begs this question, when someone's been made whole, when someone's been released and freed, how do we go about restoring them into the community and creating a sense of belonging for them? You know, I think of that man that I saw in Addis. That people just, they didn't even see him anymore. And how many times have people been healed from the demons in their life? Addictions and behaviors that have just been so offensive to so many. And then they're made whole, but the community struggles to receive them and to create a sense of belonging for them. And there's a word here for us. Jesus encourages him, stay with your people and tell them what God did for you. And he does just that. But I wonder how much he was actually received into the community to be a full functioning member of the community again. We're not told that, and so we're left wondering that question. This whole story is about Jesus facing these powers to bring someone out of bondage, to free them from either an evil system or an evil being that is tormenting him, or evil beings in this case, because there were so many. And Jesus faces the powers, the evil powers at work in this world. He wasn't only taking on religious institutions and institutional prejudice in sense of confronting people, but he was confronting the spiritual powers that are at work in our world today. And there's this great example of naming the powers that are at play. And as Jesus is talking with this man and he demands, what is your name? And that power gets identified. And one of the things that the church can do in facing the evil powers that are at work in our world today is to name them. Because when you name them and identify them, you take away some of their control and some of their power. And you know where your battle lies. And then you can decide on how you're going to confront them. Something we do really well in the church is we talk about evil as being out there. And so we talk about in the church, it's just like, it's wonderful land. Everything's great. And outside the church, everything is evil and bad and ruled by the devil. And yet I remind us that the very first exorcism Jesus did in the book of Mark is with a man who was in the synagogue, a religious man in the synagogue. And so we need to stop thinking about evil as something that's out there. and name the evil, whether it's out there or whether it's in our midst. So name those powers and then confront them. And one of the ways we confront them is through our very worship, that we resist evil through the way that we worship. Jesus heals this man at the very end. I love this point. He says to the man, "Go and tell everyone what God has done for you." And then Luke writes, "So the man went out and he told everyone what Jesus had done for him." And earlier in this story, when Jesus confronts the demons, they cry out like, "Don't torment me, Jesus, Son of God, the Most High God." The demons are identifying Jesus as Lord. And now this man is running around telling everybody that Jesus is Lord because Jesus is the one who's done this for me. When we worship Jesus and we gather together and worship God as his people, we remind ourselves that he has power over the chaos. He has power over all spiritual authorities. And our worship makes that declaration. Marva Dawn, this wonderful woman who has written so well on the idea of the powers at work in our world. She's written a book called Powers, Weakness, and the Tabernacling of God. Maybe not the best title, but a fantastic book nonetheless. She writes this: "Worship is the boldest possible act of resistance to the powers of evil because it declares that God and not the powers rule the world." Worship recenters us in our reality around Jesus to declare that he is Lord. And as Lord, Jesus has conquered all evil. And he's done it in the way that we have talked about again and again and again. And it's not through matching violence with violence. It's not through matching this kind of power with that kind of power. He does it through the weakness and the beauty of the cross. The Apostle Paul was writing to a group of Christians in what is modern-day Turkey, but it's where we get our letter Colossians. And in chapter 2, he's talking about people being really the systems that people are held in bondage to, thinking that my identity lies in this. And Paul is saying, no, your identity lies in Jesus. And he talks about Jesus destroying the accusation against his people. And he disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them through the cross. That's in Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. And there's this beauty that Jesus not only confronts this demon-possessed man and frees him, but he ultimately destroys evil through the work that he's doing on the cross. And the whole story of Luke is leading us to that climax, that fulfillment of that as we get to the end of Luke. And Paul reminds us that nothing separates us from the love of God that we see in Jesus. Life nor death, neither angels nor demons can separate us from the love of God. The weakness of the cross is his most powerful way of conquering all evil. And there's this wonderful realization that we have that as the church, we are the continuing presence of Jesus in the world today. And so we are reminded that in some ways, because we represent who Jesus is, because we are his people, it is still our job to confront the powers at work in our world today. Whether they are systemic, whether they are personal beings, our job is to war against them. And the early Christians, as you read through the scriptures, just had this awareness constantly that we are in a battle. And so Paul says in Ephesians 6, our battle isn't against flesh and blood, it's against the spiritual powers and authorities and rulers in this world. And so we don't confront evil by simply shouting at it or just pointing it out. We confront it by embodying and living out the way of Jesus. And when we gather together in community, we become the visible sign that Jesus still sets people free. You know, I've already alluded to this. Jesus, when this man says to him, I want to go with you, I want to go back, take me with you, please. And Jesus says, no, go and tell people what God did for you. This story starts with a madman in some ways, and it ends with a missionary. Because Jesus crossed lines to free him and restore him. And I think we still confront evil today because Jesus still sets people free today. And we have the wonderful ministry of telling the world about that. So has God freed you from something in your life? Celebrate that and go and tell people what he's done for you. Amen.